before we get into all of the reasons as to how that might have come about, why don't we start with unaccountable classes? So who do you mean when you're talking about unaccountable classes?
Well, first of all, it's a shout out. I start with a shout out to Richard Miniter, a American journalist, who, when he was talking on trigonometry, explained his use of the term. And I thought, that explains a lot. So the unaccountable classes, as he defines them, and I like this definition, is the people who are paid for turning up, right? So it doesn't really matter if they have any positive income on the, any positive effect on the world around them or other people, they just get paid. So obviously bureaucracies can be like that. A lot of the higher education system is like that. A lot of the schooling system's like that. A lot of the non-profits are like that. It's a very large group. And I think it's a better way of getting at the fundamental problem than the more common term, which is the professional managerial class. Because there's a lot of professionals and members of the professional managerial class whose income absolutely depends on how well they perform, in which case they're not in the unaccountable classes, they're in the accountable classes. So that's why I've shifted to Richard Miniter's analysis and definition, because I think it's a much, much more useful one for explaining what's going on and makes a much clearer split in who's doing what and why, and who's lining up with whom and why.
So the professional managerial classes that might have a tighter link between their input and performance and thus their pay. Are we talking about doctors?
It varies a bit, and it varies in the degree, but anyone who basically, has to deal with somebody who won't pay them or won't come back to them if they're not happy, is in that group.
Yeah.
So anyone who's got to get the consent of the people they're dealing with for their income has got some level of accountability. Now that doesn't solve that doesn't entirely solve issues of, asymmetric information and so forth, but they're obviously in a different position than somebody who, if they turn up, they get paid and that's the end of the story.
Okay. And I think most importantly, at the thrust of your think piece, it isn't just about saying, look, here are some unaccountable classes and what they believe. They've ultimately led to institutional capture through their beliefs about the world. But more importantly, as you say, it's not their income that has been adversely affected. But I think the other downstream impact of that, besides them sailing along, getting paid no matter what it is that they believe, and then put into some kind of institutional framework and roll that out throughout their institution, but it's happening everywhere. And so it becomes a nationwide thing, an international thing, is that it does have practical consequences for everyone else who aren't part of the unaccountable classes. So
yes,
let's start with a little bit of a excerpt, and then you can unpack that and tell us a little bit about what has been facilitated in the name of the institutional classes. So you have said the rise of the unaccountable classes has led to a shift in social and institutional dynamics that have resulted in so much institutional capture, not only pushing new norms and new sins, it also meant supplanting previous norms and claims about the world, especially those entailing strong sense of service to and respect for the concerns of the national citizenry, in favour of new framings and patterns of action supporting the new trumping moral projects, most obviously trans, and far more consequentially, mass migration. What factors do you think facilitated this new social and institutional dynamic that I think we've probably all come to recognise in our day-to-day lives?
Yeah, so I want to distinguish between institutional capture and regulatory capture, okay? So economists talk about regulatory capture, which is basically the people being regulated have the most incentives to care about the regulation, so they try and get as much influence over the regulators as possible. So the economists talk about regulatory capture. I'm talking about institutional capture, where the institution itself becomes captured by certain networks, which then push ideas and claims about the world that suit their interests. And I refer to what I call the Charlie Munger principle. The late Charlie Munger was Warren Buffett's partner, and he had a principle of life where he said, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcomes. And I've unpacked that a bit more using Bob Trivers, the evolutionary biologist's analysis of self-deception, that we're very, very good at self-deception. We're very good at moralizing and rationalizing our self-interest. And so part of what was going on is we select for things to believe that suits us, because that's what gets the reinforcing incentives going. And of course, then if you have networks of people who are all in the same situation, then you get very, very strong selection pressures. And then you get also, remembering that we're very status-driven beings because we're very social beings. So if you then are playing the same status games together, that then has further selection pressures. So what happens is we got massive expansion in bureaucratization and massive expansion in higher education. And the French political economist Piketty has mapped how we've got this shift between what he calls the Brahmin left, instead of the against the merchant right. So he's saying, instead of politics being about capital versus labour, which is what it used to be, to a large extent, labour, the working class, is being pushed out, and it's different forms of capital fighting each other. And his Brahmin left maps pretty thoroughly to the unaccountable classes, and the merchant right maps pretty thoroughly to the accountable classes. And so what you get is, if something suits the increased resources and authority of an institution, and that institution is dominated by networks of the unaccountable classes, what they will do is they will push that institution in directions that suits them. And of course, moral projects are a great way to A, increase your authority, and B, increase your access to resources. And this creates a really big problem, because you have things like, take, for example, public health, right? Take public health. We say public health is there to make us healthy. There's an incentive problem. If the population gets metabolically sicker, public health gets more resources. So it's not in the interest of public health that we be metabolically healthy. It's in the interest of public health that we be metabolically unhealthy. Acute care, on the other hand, is different. Why is acute care different? Because there's a specific illness or a specific injury which has to be specifically fixed by specific people, and you either fix it or you don't. And the incentive structures are very, very clear. But with metabolic health, we're talking about long-term things going on. The information patterns are much more obscure. And so you don't get the same good feedback systems. So you drift towards feedback systems where more sickness means more money to public health. So one of the really odd things going on is our official dietary guidelines make no sense if what you are concerned with is public health. Why do I say that? Because the evidence base for them is really weak, or even hostile, and they make no evolutionary sense. But we see again and again and again public health nutrition guidelines which are not structured for us to be healthy collectively as a population. But if you look at them, they are structured for us to be metabolically unhealthy as a population. So the selection processes were perverse. And because we're very good at self-deception and very good at rationalizing and moralizing our self-interest, this is pushing in that direction of, nutrition guidelines that make no sense. We were healthier as populations before we had nutrition guidelines.